Is Dr. Tim Nedwed, and he is the Oil Spill Response Senior Technical Professional with ExxonMobil Upstream Research Company. He has worked with ExxonMobil for 19 years and has led the Oil Spill Response Research Program for the last 12 years. His primary expertise is on oil spill response technologies with a focus on dispersants, in-situ burning, remote detection of oil, and oil spill fate and effects. He has developed new dispersant technologies, a method for detecting oil trapped under ice, and new methods for applying in-situ burning. And he's currently developing a new method of oil spill response that could be a step change advance, and is also working on 2 new technologies for oil spill prevention that could eliminate the potential for blowouts to occur. And his fun fact is that he is a backyard beekeeper. So, to Nedwed, and just a reminder for those on the phone, please mute your phones. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Yeah, I'd much rather talk about bees than oil spill response, so if you can limit your questions to bees, that would be great. So I guess I should probably stay next to this microphone, right, so people on the phone.
Yes, please. That'd be great.
Yeah, so, okay, I'll do my best. All right, so I'm going to try to give you some of industry's perspective on oil spill response, and I put 2 high-level topics here for my topics of discussion for my talk. And when I talk in front of an audience like this about oil spill response, I try to give industry's perspective on oil spill response and why we advocate for certain response technologies. So I have 2 or 3 slides to go over that, so everybody can kind of have a better understanding, perhaps. And then I'll give you what I think is maybe my perspective, but industry's perspective on oil spill response research and the relevance of it. And I think before I start, I'm going to echo what Paige said and others said. Certainly science is key to oil spill response, and we're going to base decisions as much as possible on science. And for the academics here, maybe I have a little bit of benefit being in industry and working with some of the responders. But the key to getting that science, getting new science, old science, into response is knowing who to convince, right? And so you've got to convince people like me who work for industry, and decisions that industry can influence or have to go through me if there's new science and new technology. But really you got to convince somebody like Paige Dalling and the NOAA SSCs, the state SSCs, the EPA SSCs. And there are methods of doing that, and writing a paper in an academic journal may not be the best method of getting that information in front of those people. Right, and so they have internal meetings and other type of meetings that I would encourage, and I try to, when I have new technology that we're trying to push into the response realm, I try to get in front of those folks and let them know what we're doing as much as possible, because if you don't convince somebody like Paige that your science or your technology is accurate, relevant, and then most importantly representative, it's not going to be used. It's not going to be used in the response. So just at a very high level, and I'll quickly go through these slides, this is the oil spill response toolbox, which I hope everyone knows. And I use this slide to try to make everyone understand, even people in industry don't understand why we would choose one technology over another technology for an oil spill response. As Monica said, I've led the oil spill response research for ExxonMobil for the last, actually it's 14 years now. And so the focus of our research is to develop new technologies, basically, to improve our capabilities. But when you look at oil spill response, these are the 3 primary active technologies that we would use for a large offshore spill, or any offshore spill. And before I tell you why we would want to use dispersants, I'll tell you that mechanical recovery with booms and skimmers is always going to be the most important oil spill response technology that's used. It has been in the past and it will be in the future, because most spills are small, and booms and skimmers are very good with small spills as long as you get them out there in time before the oil has broken up, spread too thin, or broken into pieces and moved in different directions. The challenge as we move into larger and larger spills is the physics of booming, right? So mechanical recovery requires booms, and in-situ burning right now requires booms. And the new technology that Monica mentioned is a method of doing in-situ burning without booms that I don't have time to talk about today. But it's the physics of keeping oil in booms. So as spills get larger and larger, the challenges and conditions get more challenging as far as wind and waves. Keeping oil and collecting enough oil in booms is the challenge. So it's the physics of boomings. So the reason we advocate for dispersants for larger spills is because dispersants have the advantage of not requiring a boat to be deployed. So both booms require boats to hold the booms, right? So the response speed is the key to oil spill response. So responding at the speed of boats is challenging the further you get away from stockpiles of equipment and the larger a spill becomes. Dispersants are the only tool as right now, they're commercially ready for being flied by an airplane. So you can't fly faster than the largest platform that we have now. This is a C-130, but they are now qualifying 727 and a 737 for applying dispersants. So now the response for dispersants can be applied at the speed of a plane. And then we're talking about Deepwater Horizon. That response had oil coming out from a point source. So if dispersants are going to be effective, it makes sense to apply right at the point source. So subsea dispersant injection is really a new tool that we have post Deepwater Horizon, but it allows us to treat large amounts of oil before it's come up to the surface and had a chance to do some things as far as spread and become more challenging for booms to capture. So that's kind of the fundamental reason. Dispersants aren't appropriate for every oil spill. Mechanical recovery is going to be the most important response option, but as spills get offshore spills get larger and further away from stockpiles of equipment, we have to have tools that can allow us to respond rapidly, and dispersants are that tool, and a tool that allows us to respond to what is primarily drives oil spill response contingency plans for drilling wells offshore, and that's worst case discharges from a loss of well control, and that's where subsea dispersant injection is important. So, I said speed is the key to oil spill response. This is a slide or an image that was collected during Deepwater Horizon on the last day of the spill. This slick came up. This is right over the response location, so the well is probably directly under these vessels that are responding to try to contain and control the well. This picture was taken on January 15th. This slick came up to the surface because they'd shut off subsea dispersant injection, as I understand, to put the capping stack in place, and that allowed this slick to come up. As I understand, I wasn't out there, as I understand, slicks like this, especially close to the well site, were not observed, but because they shut off the subsea dispersant injection on July 15th, this slick came up to the surface. This slick is estimated to be, from what we can see, it's 3 to 5 kilometers across, but it may be a lot bigger than that because I don't know how big it gets out here. This is a support vessel that's moving quickly through that slick. You can still see its wake. But if you got to envision it, if it was a response vessel that was trying to boom and skim this slick, it wouldn't be moving it fast enough so you could still see its wake. This vessel's probably moving maybe 8 to 10 knots. But if it was a response vessel trying to boom and skim oil, it would be forced to travel at 1 knot or less. Right? And then that vessel, if this slick is 3 to 5 kilometers across, it would take 3 to 4 hours to go across that slick one time. Right? And on a good day, it might be able to make another trip back, and on a perfect day, it might be able to make 3 passes, right? And 12-hour operations is challenging for this kind of activity. But you can see that one vessel would do something really trivial to this single slick that was on the water surface during that spill. So you can see this really illustrates the challenges of applying a response with a boat. A single C-130 plane could treat this entire slick in 1 8-hour operational period, right? So its encounter rate is so much greater than vessels. You might ask, well, since this is the only skimming and booming and recovering oil with a skimmer is the only response option that's picking the oil up and putting it back in a container, and it came out of a container. Well, let's just put 10 or 100 times as many of these vessels out there, and we can do something meaningful. But it's not that easy because of the challenges of keeping oil contained in booms, right? So when winds drive waves that are greater than 3 to 5 feet, you have a challenge keeping oil in booms, right? So you can't just add additional equipment at a lot of times to increase the efficiency of this type of response. I put this slide in here because when I come to conferences like this and other conferences and industry conferences, you don't kind of hear the story that the Gulf of Mexico is really after Deepwater Horizon, it's not in such bad shape, right? You hear about the damages and the impacts, and you hear about the lab-based testing that shows all of the impacts. But the reality is this is data that was I collected from NOAA's fisheries website, and I've been collecting this data. They haven't come out with the 2016 data yet, but this shows the estimates of the commercial fish catch in the Gulf of Mexico every year back to the year 2000. And then also I show the value of that catch. So 2010 there was a drop in fishing, in the fish catch and the value of the fish because there was a moratorium on fishing for 6 months. But you see in 2011 the metric tons of fish caught went above the long-term average, the average from 2000. So the fish catch was not influenced by the skill. And in fact, I argue that the moratorium allowed the fish populations to actually expand. And that's why the fish catch was greater in 2011. And then we can see as we go on in time, the fish catch and the value is not significantly less than the long-term average. It's kind of bouncing around like you'd expect in a healthy commercial fish and catch environment. Okay. Okay, so the rest of my talk I'm going to talk about, maybe give you my perspective on research and science related to oil spill response. And I say that oil spills are an opportunity for research, but it cannot disrupt response, and Paige said that earlier today. And so, but it's also not expected to inform current response, right? Because the challenges and the time that it takes to look at the data that's collected and interpret it and come to a conclusion is not in a time frame that allows decision making, and the response team wants to have information to allow them to make decisions for the next day or the next week. So there is a place for research and response to inform future responses, but it's challenging for research to inform the current response. The second bullet is something I think is important, and maybe there's a good understanding of that here, but certainly academics need to collaborate more with the response community. And so we do as much as we can in industry to try to work with academic institutions and all the consortia that have been developed post Deepwater Horizon to allow them to have the knowledge that we've gained not only on research itself, but the knowledge that we have about the limitations and the challenges of response. So it's key to turning the research into commercial technology, but I'd say maybe not rarely happens, but it doesn't happen as much as it should. And the key is having the implicit knowledge that the responders have, right, and having that be in the room when these research projects and plans and protocols are developed is really important. And I'll tell you a quick story. I was watching this movie called Sully. I don't know if anybody's seen the movie Sully about the U.S. Airways. The movie is about the NTSB investigation after the event, and it really tells you why this implicit knowledge that the practitioners have is really key to doing things. So the NTSB goes through this movie, and it's all about their investigation to make sure to see if he made the right decision. And so they do all these simulations, and a scene at the very end of the movie is where there's a big room with the NTSB investigators, and a bunch of scientists in the room, and they're watching these pilots do simulations of the event, right? A bird struck this plane. Sully had 208 seconds before the plane landed in the Hudson after the bird strike. Well, the simulations showed the pilots in the simulations, the bird strike happened, okay, let's immediately turn around and go back and we can land back at LaGuardia. And so they were arguing that Sully made the wrong decision. And it wasn't until they had done this full investigation and were in front of this big crowd that this Captain Sully had actually seen what they were doing for the response. And his implicit knowledge changed the whole story and how the simulations were won, but it was at the very end. But he said, we didn't know if the bird strike had killed the engines, right? It took us time to go through an investigation while we were in that plane. And he said it took at least 35 seconds for us to see that the plane was not able to power itself anymore. We didn't have the luxury of saying, oh, bird strike, turn around and immediately go back. If you did that, the plane still had enough altitude. But it's his implicit knowledge that was in the room, and they did a lot of work without his implicit knowledge, trying to prove that he made the wrong decision. When they subtracted those 35 seconds from the 208 seconds, the plane could not make it back, and they proved that he made the right decision. But it took him, who was actually on the ground in that position, to put that kind of implicit information that they didn't know about into that modeling. So the next couple of slides, so there's been a lot of research going on since 2010, and a lot of it is good science, but then a lot of it is good, it's good science, but it may not be science that is representative of the problem that we have at hand. And so I have a few bullets of describing some of the research issues that we see with some of the science that's coming out over the last 4 or 5 years. And one of the big ones that we have right now is this one. Dispersed oil biodegradation studies need to use representative real-world concentrations. We wrote a paper in 2013 that describes what real-world concentrations are. We still see biodegradation papers that come out with concentrations that are orders of magnitude too high, right? In the real world, if you effectively disperse oil, it's going to go into the water column. In an open ocean environment, it's going to dilute very quickly. And it's going to dilute to concentrations that are on the order of parts per million or less within a few hours. And these biodegradation studies last they last, some of them can last up to 60 days. And exposing the bacteria to concentrations of dispersed oil on the order of 10, 100, or even 1,000 parts per million is just not relevant. It's not representative of what the real world is. Over a 60-day period, biodegradation is going to occur at concentrations less than 1 part per million. And so when we look at the studies that try to represent those real-world concentrations, we see robust biodegradation happen. When you look at studies that don't use those concentrations, the conclusions are all over the place. And that's an important one, and that is a message we've been trying to deliver for a long time, but we still see research being conducted at unrepresentative concentrations. Toxicity testing is another issue. Toxicologists do studies, and their goal is to cause an effect to an organism, so they need to use a concentration that causes effect. The papers, most of the papers, a lot of the papers that come out do that, right? That's how you do good science. But a lot of them don't relate the concentrations where they saw an effect back to what the real world concentrations were. And a lot of times they're much less than their effects concentrations. And then we still see challenges with papers trying to do dispersant-related research on and representing environments where dispersants would not be used. Dispersants are a tool for offshore conditions where you have enough water to have dilution. We wouldn't recommend that we use dispersants in a marsh or next to a beach or in intertidal areas. And so studies that are doing that kind of research may be good science, but they may not be relevant to inform decision making. And then this is another one that we see an issue with. There's a disconnect right now, and there's questions. Fodry at the University of North Carolina has a paper, and he's describing this disconnect between effects measured in lab-based toxicity study and lack of population effects in the real world. And the paper concludes with there's really not a good understanding of why there is a disconnect, right? They do lab-based toxicity studies, they're finding effects, and what they look at they go out in the real world and look at the populations, and the populations are still robust. So why is there a disconnect? And I just put a couple of points here, and I haven't seen these reasons written up in the paper, but exposure conditions, this is concentration times time, in the lab are typically far greater than what organisms would encounter in the real world. But also the at-risk organisms have reproductive schemes that allow for high numeric losses, right? So you can see high numeric losses in the Gulf of Mexico. It can be a resilient place for some of and these species that could have been impacted. If they were impacted, their populations might not be affected. And this is something that's recently coming out with the research on marine snow. So dispersed oil that ultimately reaches the seabed in deep water has almost certainly undergone loss of almost all of the soluble components. So a lot of the papers that have come out are using these tracers, Hopane tracers, and they'll take sediment samples and measure the concentration, determine the concentration of Hopane, and use that as a surrogate for the whole oil. And so when they come back and estimate how much oil made it to the sediments, they'll say that they've measured Hopane, and then they'll figure out how much Hopane was in the fresh oil, and they'll describe many times more oil that would be in the sediments than was possible because the oil is biodegraded. The Hopane is not biodegrading very well, but the other components are biodegrading. So it's just a fraction of what was in the whole oil is making it to the sediments. And then it's important to understand that this oil that makes it to the sediments, and now I'm talking about oil that was effectively dispersed and took a long time to make it to the sediments, you wouldn't describe that as oil anymore. It wouldn't have the properties of oil any longer, right? It would be a residue that's got a lot of asphaltenes and tar, and it wouldn't have oily characteristics. It would be a solid or a semi-solid particle. And we have a paper that's in review right now, but it leaves a residue that is low in toxicity because the soluble components have been removed from that oil, and the soluble components are what drive a lot of the toxicity from crude oil. I mentioned that last point. So just to summarize, large offshore spills are challenged by the physics of booming. I described that at the beginning. Dispersants are a robust option, and they're important because they can rapidly treat large areas, and they can treat oil at the release point. That's why they're an important response option. If we can only apply dispersants from boats, they may not be much better than any other response option. They may not be worse than other response options because they are not bringing oil out of the marine environment. And I mentioned this research during spills likely won't inform the current response. It's important to do that research, but that research, as Paige said, that research cannot interrupt the response or put the responders or the researchers at a safety risk. And then academic and the response community collaboration is key for moving science to the commercial realm and getting it used in response. I believe it's the implicit knowledge that folks like Paige have, that I have, that people who are in the oil spill response business, the oil spill response organizations, and I think a lot of those folks would be very willing to work with the academics and be a part of either technical advisory committees on some of these large research consortia that are being placed. And then representativeness is something that we're seeing a challenge. It's very challenging to take a beaker study and say that is representative of the real world. So you need to know the limitations of lab-based, and even doing large basins, there's challenges with converting the data and results from lab or basin-based research and saying that's representative of the real world. And you need to know those limitations. So with that, I'm getting the red card here, so I will stop. So I have a list of references. I guess these talks will be available for everyone. So with that, I'll pass it to Ed.
Great. Oh, flying in.